Okay, testing, 1, 2, 3.
I often get on airplanes where it's better to have something smaller. It's not that in Europe in general. That's right away. See you next week. Actually, believe it or not, so I've got two things I'm doing. One's in Herning, Denmark. You know where that is? It's a Jylland. Or Jutland. And I'm going to Costa Brava, which is an hour north of Barcelona. And two tiny little airports in both areas. And believe it or not, there's a non-stop on Ryanair. Every other day, and not the day I want to go. I couldn't believe it was a month. I was willing to find Ryanair for that. So instead, I'm doing an overnight in Brussels. I vowed never fly Ryanair again, but here I was. And that was like 20 years ago. I learned before I took Ryanair.
Well, I remember going from
Here, do you want me to put it up here? Just take it.
The airport actually in Belgium, I think.
Do you want me to just talk to you?
Well, this is an interesting question as well. And this is partly my fault. But the guy driving the airport got us there 1 minute late. Now, that is never a problem for me on all the airlines that I have. I mean, 1 minute for checking in. It's never been a problem for me. I always can talk my way. Just carry on day. There was no one to talk to. In fact, I could look through the window and I could see that who had been the gate was getting on the plane, lining people. No! So I had to sit in the airport in Frankfurt, because there's no transportation anymore, for 5 hours, and pay €120 change fee for my £1 ticket.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. Please feel free to continue eating your lunches. My name is Deborah Collier. I am the Technology and Telecommunications Policy Director for Citizens Against Government Waste. We will be talking today about spectrum, which is a vital, valuable, and limited resource that allows the transmission of data from one point to another. The most recognizable uses for spectrum are for mobile communications using cell phones or smartphones, broadcast television and radio, as well as unlicensed uses that allow for wireless remotes to communicate with garage door openers, baby monitors, and several other devices. That's why it's so unusual for spectrum to be left unused for a long period of time. But that's been the case for the past 20 years for a small but critical piece of spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band. On October 21st, 1999, the Federal Communications Commission granted exclusive rights to 75 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz range for the development of dedicated short-range communications, also known as DSRC, operating in the Intelligent Transportation System radio service for vehicle-to-vehicle communications between automobiles. The FCC's report and order stated that the spectrum could only be used for DSRC systems and that the automotive industry had been exploring as an option to improve traffic safety. Currently, only two major manufacturers have been developing DSRC to actually put into vehicles, and only one vehicle had been deployed on the roads, and that vehicle is scheduled to be discontinued following this model year. While the development of DSRC technology has been essentially unproductive, many other autonomous safety innovations in the automotive industry have sprouted, including lane keeping support systems, blind spot information technology, LiDAR, and automated parking systems. These technologies detect objects surrounding the vehicles and alert drivers regardless of the safety features of those objects. DSRC communicates using transponders or onboard units with other vehicles or other devices that use DSRC, and with roadside units that are also on the same spectrum to detect hazards such as a vehicle approaching a curve too fast. DSRC can also be used to collect tolls, which is already being done with technology such as the easy passes that we use here in Washington or e-pass in other states, as well as parking payments. To be fully effective, DSRC must be installed in every single automobile on the road. For example, a DSRC-enabled vehicle is not necessarily going to recognize a 1969 Volkswagen Beetle. The Volkswagen Beetle owner, would be able to purchase on the secondary market possibly a DSRC communications unit to install, but if it doesn't have that, the cars with DSRC enabled are not going to be able to recognize it. However, another vehicle using, say, LiDAR or cameras or other technology would be able to recognize that 69 Beetle as an object that should be avoided. According to the Auto Alliance, automobile manufacturers spend more than $100 billion each year on research and development worldwide and are actively working on new safety and V2V communication technologies, including sensors, cameras, and radar-based systems. Because the 5.9 gigahertz spectrum was allocated for DSRC technology, any other use of the spectrum, like vehicle to infrastructure or cellular vehicle to everything, requires a waiver from the FCC before testing can be conducted within that spectrum band. This takes time and waste money, which is one of the many reasons that the FCC needs to conduct a review of the spectrum to ensure that it is allocated for the best possible uses. Today, we welcome Futurist and autonomous vehicle expert Brad Templeton, Vice President of Policy at TechFreedom, Ian Adams, and for an informal discussion on autonomous vehicles, 5G, and the 5.9 gigahertz band, moderated by Austin Bonner, an attorney with Harris, Wiltshire, and Grannis. You will find profiles of each of our panelists in the packet on your chairs. Austin, at this point, I turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you, Deb, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. So to set the stage for our panelists, one of the things that's challenging about this policy debate is that it's been going on a really long time, and a lot has changed in recent years. There have been changes in government. DOT has abandoned the idea of mandating DSRC. There have been changes in technology for vehicles that Brad and I will talk about a little bit today, and there have been changes in unlicensed use. Wi-Fi 6 is continuing the meteoric rise in the need for spectrum for Wi-Fi. So we're going to set the record straight on some of those issues today. And Brad, I'd like to start with you. So as someone who's a real expert in the future of driving, can you give us the 2-minute version on autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles? Are they the same thing?
Well, they're not the same thing. Autonomous vehicles are tremendously impactful technology that's going to change everything about cities, how we live, how we get around. But by and large, if you go and talk to the people working on these, particularly in the startups, the non-traditional companies who are working on it, and you ask them, do you intend to talk to the other cars in order to make this work? And they'll say no, there's no real plan for that, with the exception of people doing truck platooning. They do use communication between the vehicles to do the truck platooning. And this was surprising to me, in fact, when I was working at what's now Waymo, Google's self-driving car project in its early days. I did an investigation for them of what was going on in what's called the ITS world, the Intelligent Transportation System world, and was surprised that none of the technologies there seemed to be particularly useful for self-driving cars. So there is a safety case for communications between cars. I don't think we can say there's absolutely no case. But it turns out to be a lot weaker, in my judgment, than has been expressed by many of the people who are pushing for it. There is a corresponding security risk case in any communication that's done between 2-ton robots that are wandering the streets and every other being they come against and every other piece of road infrastructure. In the security world, we say you teach your computers the same thing you teach small children: don't talk to strangers. And the idea that every car will exchange complex messages with every other car presents a security risk which, at least to fixing today, is not within human competence. Maybe someday security will get that good, but no one's ever built a system like that. So you need to balance the gains you might get from the protocol against the security risks that you'll create. Now, as was mentioned, a whole bunch of other technologies are being developed or already developed and spurred by self-driving vehicle technology. And those technologies, including sensor technology, low-cost camera technologies, radar, a lot of other technologies are making it possible to detect many of the things that people hoped to detect through radio. Radio, unfortunately, will never work perfectly. Amazingly to me, when I researched this, 2 million of the 12 million accidents in the United States every year that are reported to insurance companies, which is about a sixth, are with deer. And we have not yet figured out how to get the deer to wear transponders.
I'm sure someone's working on it.
Well, if you told the hunters they could shoot deer with transponders instead of killing them, maybe they would like that. But so you're not going to ever get to the level of safety you need. Self-driving cars need to reach a level of safety that's extremely high. We'll call it safe enough, but safe enough is really quite high. So they need to do that whether the other vehicle has a radio, a transponder, or not. And so because they have to get there already, they're seeing the radio technology as just a tiny, small increment and not the essential tool that is often described as it being.
So we've heard, and I think Deb referenced, there's sort of 2 leading connected vehicle technologies, DSRC and CVDEX. What's the difference?
They're actually very similar. DSRC was devised in the 90s, as she described, and it's based on Wi-Fi. It's actually a variation of Wi-Fi. CV2X was created by Qualcomm, and it's a variation of LTE protocols. And the only difference is actually the underlying radio protocol. On top of that, the messages they send, each car transmitting, here I am, here's where I'm going, here's what I'm doing, those are identical between the 2 systems. Now, one important difference about CV2X is, as coming from the wireless carriers, it works in 2 modes. One is, like DSRC, a direct car-to-car mode, and the other is it can relay through more advanced cell towers. And that way, you can gain the advantage of talking to something that's high up on a pole instead of to another car, get a little more range, get relaying, still get good speed. The disadvantage is you're now using infrastructure that belongs to private companies who are, some of you are in the room, I'm sorry, but not always the easiest people to deal with, as opposed to a protocol that would work everywhere in the world. So, but other than that, they're actually pretty similar. I will say this, the DSRC designed in 1995 through 2000, is now approaching being a 25-year-old protocol, will be one certainly if it's ever deployed. And are a lot of you using your 25-year-old cell phones a lot? So the answer is not. And so I will give CV2X the point that it's based on more recent radio technology. But I believe actually any nailing down of the technology is a mistake in a world where we just learn so much every year, and we learn at a faster rate every year.
So building on that point about nailing down a specific technology, Ian, I think Deb mentioned that the rules right now for the 5.9 gigahertz band only allow DSRC. So the FCC has sort of picked a technology among competitors. Is that normal?
Well, it's not normal and it's not productive at the end of the day. For all of the technical reasons that were just laid out, it's something that presents a real challenge just because we see innovators around the world, and in this country in particular, when they're given the room and they're given the ability to find new solutions to problems, they tend to do just that. And so we've got our hands tied in a really important arena. And I think at the end of the day, vehicle safety is of paramount importance. But I tend to place my belief in entrepreneurs and in innovation. And when the government chooses a particular way to go, even in the name of regulatory certainty, I think we have to be willing to take another look, a fresh look back at that to see what results are we really getting.
So because the band has sort of been locked up by these rules, can you give us a sense of sort of what's going on in the band today?
Unfortunately, it looks like not a lot. So what we've seen is very limited practical deployment of these technologies, which of course is a problem because the success, the safety case for this technology is predicated on widespread deployment. We just haven't seen that. And it's something where even if we do start to see the beginning of broader deployment, it doesn't solve our problem. We still have a mixed fleet for a long time. I mean, the average car on America's roads is 11 years old. So the amount of time it would take to bring an already older technology to a point where it could realize those safety benefits, it's probably prohibitive.
Let me add that when it comes to communications technologies, no one's ever successfully deployed one that didn't provide value to the first people to buy it.
Right.
Two people buy a fax machine, or a company buys two fax machines and puts them in two offices, they're faxing. Many years later, they find out they can fax other companies. A company puts an email for its employees. Years later, they find they can email other companies. Unfortunately, this kind of protocol wouldn't even provide value to the first 25 million people to buy it. If 25 million people bought it, it would be in 10% of the cars in the United States, which would mean that it would work one time in 100 because you need both of them to have it in a safety incident. So only with a mandate, which of course they have proposed, so far not happened, could you even think about getting to a level where it would provide the value you're looking for. You tend to need to give a technology that's going to be valuable to the first adopters, or it won't get the explosive growth that technologies need to change the world.
So on that point, I think I've seen a few times DOT has created a map that shows all of the existing and proposed DSRC deployments, and it's about 18,000 devices. Is that a lot for a technology that's been around for 20 years?
As I mentioned, there are 250 million vehicles on the American road and close to 1 billion around the world. There are some other countries where there's maybe been a little bit more, but it's mostly been test projects. And as I did mention very briefly, one company that I know called Peloton does truck platooning with it. But that's an example of the technology being useful to the first person to buy it because two trucks buy it and then they can platoon together. They don't need to worry about whether anyone else has it. So that's the way you get a technology to deploy.
Are there other reasons that you think there are some sort of advanced driving companies are skeptical of things like DSRC?
Well, I mean, I think to exactly that point, we have alternative technologies that can be offering us today safety benefits that are realizable without widespread proliferation of the technology. And for that reason, I think we have to be thinking seriously about the advantages of those technologies.
I'd also advise that there are many solutions to some of these problems from the new technologies that are actually better than the solutions that were proposed. For example, a very common proposal, the value of radio communications like DSRC, is that cars might know that another car is coming, it's hidden in a corner behind a building, it's going to run the red light, and you'll get a warning and you can stop and not hit him, which, obviously preventing that is a fantastically great thing. But it would actually be better to put that on the traffic light and have the traffic light turn red for everybody. Then everyone would know, not just the car with the radio, and not just if the other car has a radio. All intersection collisions could be detected by that traffic light and warn the other drivers through red lights and other purposes. So sometimes it may be better to do it another way, and the radio way seemed cool, and this is a particular case. I'll get a little technical for you, that in order for this technology to actually work and provide a real safety case, you need a lot of things to happen. You need a need for a very quick, what's called low latency communications, and also you need for the two vehicles not to be able to see each other, because sensors now work and provide a better solution when the vehicles can see each other. Right? My car has automatic emergency braking. If a car in front of it brakes, it sends a warning to me and it hits the brakes for me. A lot of people have that in their car. That works no matter what that other car is doing or what kind of equipment's in that car. So they need to do it, but what it won't do, maybe, is if a big truck's in front of me and then another truck's in front of him and hits the brakes, DSRC could help me learn that, and that would be a benefit. But it's a very small benefit. It's only in these specialized cases that you get that benefit, and it's a very high-cost way to get that benefit. So do we want car communications? Actually, I think they could be useful for some things. I think they could be implemented, and of course the people who are the advocates behind DSRC will disagree with me strongly on this, but I believe we could achieve a lot in shared bands, including the unlicensed bands or the white TV white spaces or some of the other shared bands that are out there. What they say, and they're correct in saying this, is that it wouldn't be as perfect if we didn't push everyone else out of the band. We'd have to deal with some interference. Maybe you would die, they will say, because your car missed a signal because someone else was watching video over Wi-Fi. And it's true that it's harder to work in a shared band. But I proposed to the FCC, and nothing happened because of this, that if they decide to open up the spectrum to unlicensed use and Wi-Fi use, it would quickly show up inside of these. They could make a rule that says if you want to put this band into your phone or other mobile device, do a car safety protocol in that band on the phone. Here's an interesting thing. As I mentioned, it would take a long time for every car to have car communications in it for safety if we just put it in the cars and we sell the cars 19 million a year, however we're selling them. If you put it in the phone, it would be in every car in America in 2 years, because this phone is less than a year old, and I'm going to have another one in a year, and that's true of all of you too. And the technology in this phone was designed 6 months before it came out, and the software on this phone was written last week. Nothing that can be done in here should be done anywhere else, because this wins. And this costs, it's amazing what's in this for what you pay. They're getting kind of expensive, some of them. But still, it's amazing what's in there for under $1,000, because these are made in the billions, and nothing else is made in the billions. So I think actually if you focus on these devices, you can get better solutions than trying to put it in the cars.
That's really interesting. So I want to pick up on a point you made earlier, which is the cybersecurity question. So I've seen some recent studies that frankly freaked me out about how much damage you can do by taking control of just a few cars. What should policymakers be concerned about in this space?
Well, existing cars basically were designed with almost no security in them. So the scary stories about today's cars shouldn't necessarily scare you about the future, although the general principle should definitely scare you. And I believe that securing the future cars is one of the most important computer security challenges there is out there, because it is a 2-ton robot. Now it's controllable by the software inside it. And I don't know if you've any read a novel by Stephen King called Christine, but that's not out of the question. Well, okay, it's not a demon, but it's not. It's not out of the question that that someone else could take over control of a vehicle if it has insecure communications. And the more it talks to, the more risk there is of that. In the computer security world, we call these the attack surfaces, the places that someone could get in. And you don't want more of them. So I believe that, well, there is value in connectivity for cars, and there will be connectivity. That connectivity in most cases should be limited to the car talking to its headquarters, and its headquarters hoping to understand and relay information from other cars, from the rest of the world. And I think the car should actually be a little afraid of headquarters. because headquarters also will be under attack and will be compromised. And the attackers here include, unfortunately, nation-state actors, intelligence agencies in China, North Korea, various other places that you can name to scare people in this town. That they're very serious threats. I mean, and by the way, if I were in another country, I'd warn you about the NSA, all right, because they also have tremendous capability in this area. So the less connectivity, the easier it is to assure that security problem. And when, your iPhone can't run you over, even though you might like that to be secure too.
Well, so turning from the nightmare fuel, Ian, you mentioned that
It's happy news.
Given the limited use of the band, do you think there are some options for the FCC to try to make more efficient use of the 5.9 band?
I mean, I think this is a real opportunity for the FCC, and it's an example where doing nothing feels increasingly less like an option. So, I mean, whether it's going to be splitting the band moving forward in that way or freeing it up for unlicensed use in toto, I mean, it doesn't matter. They need to start doing something. They need to start thinking seriously about this and having engineers ask really serious questions. I would hasten to add that I think the thing that can supplement and enhance auto safety more quickly than virtually anything else that the government does would be to pass federal automated vehicle legislation that removes uncertainty around which levels of government are involved, that removes barriers to testing and deployment of these vehicles in terms of the number of exemptions, and also actually creates a path for relevant regulators to promulgate regulations specific to such vehicles. And we missed that opportunity in the last Congress. We have an opportunity in this Congress. We should take it.
And it sounds like FCC action doesn't need to wait on Congress. There
Absolutely
are
not.
options today.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I'm a giant fan of unlicensed spectrum. And I would be, in fact, very disappointed if what we say today led to this being auctioned off to somebody. I think that would be a tragedy. I think unlicensed spectrum, especially the Part 15 rules that created the 2.4 gigahertz band that we do Wi-Fi in originally, I think that created the greatest revolution in the history of radio. Right? I mean, I think that leaving out the spectrum to anyone to use, putting some simple rules about how much power you can transmit, and saying one magical, miraculous line that was in Part 15, that if there's interference, it is the problem of the receiver. In the old days, the rule was if there's interference, it was the transmitter who was supposed to fix it. And you could call the FCC and they would send somebody out to that guy who was transmitting incorrectly and say, don't do that. Right? So this enforcement by agency instead of enforcement by technology, this flip, created an amazing revolution. And I want to see more of it. I want to see the TV white spaces expanded and used. I would unsell all the bands. I don't think the government should grant monopolies to spectrum to people. I think spectrum is too valuable that some people should get to own monopolies in it. Some of you may work with carriers here and you're not going to agree with me on that because you like having those monopolies, but this really is the government. Bands are like colors. It's like the government said, okay, Verizon owns blue and AT&T owns red and nobody else can use those colors. That's what we have done, and I don't think it's actually the right approach. Now, it's not as simple as I've just said. There are arguments about it. So anyway, I would love to see unlicensed use, and I know the Wi-Fi people, because there is a Wi-Fi band at 5.8 gigahertz, would find it technologically valuable to extend that band. But the truth is, we're now at the point actually where multi-band radios are very common and cheap and everything, and it's not so essential to be adjacent. But more unlicensed use would be a great thing.
Are there new things coming with Wi-Fi 6 that we ought to have in mind? I keep seeing a lot of talk about 160 megahertz channels.
Well, what's important is not actually what you see in Wi-Fi 6 or what you see in 5G. It's the fact that you've given the freedom to make Wi-Fi 7 and Wi-Fi 8 and other generations of technology. The internet, I use this as a metaphor for everything now, but friends of mine call the internet the stupid network, and we call it that because there was a phone company product in the 80s called intelligent networking. How many of you are old enough? Do you remember in the 80s there used to be these things called phones on desks with wires coming out of them, right? And people used to talk on them. Well, that was what the intelligent network was about, was giving you voicemail on the phone you already had. The voicemail was in the network, and your phone was the same phone you always had. And the internet flipped that upside down and said, let's make the network really stupid, and all the intelligence of the internet is in this and the web server that you're talking to, right? It's not in the network. And because of that, the people who make these and the people who make laptops and the people who make web servers, they could do anything they wanted. Friends of mine created Skype which of course is now the largest provider of long-distance voice in the world, had they had to go to the network and say, hey, networks, would you mind if we build this thing that eats your lunch? Would never have happened. A world where innovators can do this and basically not have anyone who can tell them no, not have any monopoly owner of any of the infrastructure, is a world where we get wonderful stuff. And so Wi-Fi 6 is just the beginning of what you really want to ask for. In fact, that's already been thought of, so it's boring. What I think is valuable is the stuff we haven't thought of.
So I want to make sure we touch a little bit on the economic aspects. Ian, I know you've done some writing about the economic value of potentially repurposing some or all of the 5.9 gigahertz band. What should we know about the potential gains that are there?
Well, they're enormous. I think that's the one takeaway. If there are other uses, virtually any other use would be more efficient than what we're seeing right now. The 2018 study from RAND, I commend that to you if you've not yet taken a look at it, because it tells the whole story. And if you're not interested just in the bare dollars and cents, take a look at the number of vehicles on the road with this technology, and that will tell the story to you as well. So there are any number of other uses. I think that it is for subsequent FCC investigation to determine and take a serious look at what those should be. But I think it's clear that we are not getting the bang for the buck that we should otherwise be expecting on the basis of monopolistic use in this case.
So I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions for the audience, but I want to ask you sort of two big thing questions before I turn it over. And the first one is, given everything we've just discussed, if you could wave a magic wand today and change the 5.9 gigahertz band, what would it look like eventually?
Oh, you don't want to ask me that.
Well, now I'd kind of like to know the answer.
No, my answer is very radical, and very few people agree with it yet, but I'd get rid of the FCC.
I haven't heard that one before.
I'd get rid of spectrum allocation. I think that instead...
Brad, I'm supposed to be the libertarian on the panel.
Yeah. Well, no, so there would be a regulation, but it would be more of a court, and it would be a rule that you play nice. And if you're not playing nice, you can sue other people who aren't playing nice, and you get to play non-nice for 5 years to give you a chance to replace your old equipment. So I gave the three-word abolish the FCC answer when the answer is really more complex. So if I'm going to go so far as to that, I would say that 5.9 gigahertz is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what should be done in expanding unlicensed use and letting it be used by the people. So instead of selling monopolies to companies, give it to the people and let the companies make a lot of money selling the people tools with which to use it, and to use it fairly and share in a reasonable way. But that's where you'd actually get all the value. In fact, I think it's kind of interesting. There's a big debate in Spectrum about first responders got to have their own spectrum, right? Right. So we know what happened. I guess this is the anniversary, so I shouldn't really be talking about it today. But pretend we're on another day, and I'll talk about that day where they said, oh, these radios here couldn't talk to those radios there because they use different bands because they were designed on this proprietary system. And if in fact what they had said was, you know what, we're going to give away the spectrum that's used by emergency first responders into open use by all equipment, what would have happened is there would have been a world where everything talked to everything within those bands. And the radios would cost 1/10 of what they cost, and they would do 100 times as much. And I'm not making up those numbers. That's what the approach I advocate would have brought in that space, and I believe it's true in this space too.
So Ian, maybe you could take the next step, sort of given the world of the federal regulator that we are operating in.
Because that's not going to happen.
The FCC has a lot of options. What's a good next step?
So, I take reliance interests very seriously. That there has been significant investment made in this area, and I think for federal regulators to be taken seriously moving forward when they make such commitments, it's vital that we follow appropriate processes and really evaluate not only what is most economically efficient, but also what other technologies are out there. So, I think I would stop short of abolishing outright a federal agency, but I
know it's not going to happen.
I would say that the FCC should undertake an action to really take a look at the disposition. That's the next step. I'm not an engineer. I can't tell you what that outcome should be, but I can tell you that the value that we're gaining right now is just not enough.
So that makes me think of one sort of nitty question that I want to ask you on the FCC front, which is, you mentioned sort of reliance interests going forward, and I know a lot of people have talked about the uncertainty in this band. There's at least one proposal on the table that would sort of fundamentally change the rules for the band on the basis of a waiver. What do you think about that?
I don't think that that's sufficient. I think that what you need is waivers are subject to interpretation moving forward and don't have the same sort of binding effect that one would hope for in the long term. And so that's where I think a more permanent action is probably necessary.
I haven't studied the waiver in particular. Are you talking about the idea of CV2X wanting the lower half of the band, and is that the one we're talking about?
I think it's actually the upper part of the band.
Well, sorry, they want the upper part, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but that's because they are not idiots when it comes to the engineering, and they know there's
Right.
more interference in the lower part of the band, potential for that, than there is in the upper part of the band. So if you're going to choose your half. But again, I think sharing by law is the wrong approach. I think the right approach is tell the engineers, you must figure out how to share this. And it is surprising how well they'll do when posed that problem.
So we've reached the part of the afternoon where I think we ought to take some questions from the audience. I know we've got somebody coming around with a microphone. Who would like to get us started?
Please say your name and where you're from.
Hi, this is Rick Tucker with MMTC. It's a good panel, but I think what I'm missing, and I'm hearing multiple things. So DSRC is technology, and 5.9 is band we are talking. What's unclear to me, and because at some point we talk about shortcomings of DSRC, and then we are saying that let's clear 5.9. So my question here is that, are you suggesting that DSRC is old, which is old, 25 years, and update that and keep it in 5.9, or vacate 5.9, or do both?
Well, it's not bound to that band. In fact, in Japan, DSRC is done in another band. And China has decided to use their band only for CV2X as opposed to DSRC. So these are all options that are on the table if people are going ahead with this. I believe the question that our hosts are after is the 5.9 gigahertz band being wasted as right now an experimental band and the hope for useful band for car safety. But without actually commenting too much on DSRC itself, I mean, the truth is you could slot in a different protocol. Now, they spent 25 years trying to get DSRC right, so if you told them switch to a new protocol, they resist that, of course, even though that's what Qualcomm did when they made their V2X proposal. But the two are separate things, the band and the use.
I want to take a moderator's privilege to ask you a follow-up question about that.
Okay.
So you've mentioned several times sort of technologies that have achieved fast, widespread adoption and brought down device costs really fast. It's because they're produced in enormous numbers.
Yes.
So you just described a sort of regional split on who's using DSRC and who's using CV2X. I think I understand that Europe has settled on DSRC potentially.
Yeah, well, Europe is still got some debate, but I think they're leaning DSRC. The United States is still leaning DSRC. China has made a decision for CV2X.
Do you think that interferes with widespread adoption?
I mean, it interferes to some degree. The volumes in all of these regions are large enough that, I mean, they're not the volumes of cell phones. I mean, cell phones are an order of magnitude larger than cars in terms of the amount of deployment, but they're still pretty high. I mean, we've got, what, 19 million cars sold a year in the United States, so that's pretty good business.
That's interesting that that number is so low compared to the number of cars that are actually on the road.
Yeah, well, there's about 250 million, I believe, in the United States. China is now the world's #1 car manufacturing country by a large margin. And so they're going to get plenty of volume in China regardless of what we do.
Other questions from the audience?
Howard Wesker, Communications Daily. So yesterday there was a spectrum, there was a administration spectrum summit that included a Department of Transportation speaker. And among all the federal officials there, that speakers sort of seemed to draw a line in the sand about, we don't want people to touch the spectrum. It has to be safety spectrum. Are you surprised, or what's your analysis of where DOT is right now? And did you expect to see more movement at this point, at this point in this administration?
I mean, that would be my hope. DOT has, of course, committed to a technology-neutral approach because DOT is dealing with all kinds of new proposals, new technologies, new considerations. And so I am a little surprised that they've not moved forward on this, have not evolved their thinking on this. But I'm hopeful that they will, just because at the end of the day, there's such a diversity of interests within the auto industry. There are so many different bets and approaches being made on a technological basis that I would think they would be wanting to go to their resident regulator, their home regulator, and make the case for why having greater flexibility is beneficial to them.
And this is commercial spectrum, right? This, the FCC has a decision to make.
Right.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I'd class it as commercial spectrum in the same way that.
Oh, I just mean under the control of the FCC, not
Oh, okay, yeah.
NTIA.
So, well, it should not be surprising, though, if I were in the DOT's shoes and I said I've got ownership of this band. It's obviously it's nice to own the band and say nobody else can do anything here. Who wouldn't want that? The question is that the best choice in the broad question of what we do with all of our bands? But I'm not at all surprised that they want it. I'm not at all surprised that they've been working on it for a long time. They devoted a lot of effort into trying to see if they can solve safety problems with it. It's totally natural that they would not want to abandon that.
Hi, David Down with Comcast. So, Brad, I'm sure you follow the FCC proceeding a little bit here. One of the proposals is splitting the band, I guess, and giving 30 to DSRC and auto and 45 to the Wi-Fi and license industry. And the autos say that's completely insufficient. You mentioned deployments in other countries, and I understand those use closer to the 30 megahertz. Do you know why the autos in the US want all 75? What they intend to do with it? I mean, if the rest of the world is doing it over 30?
Well, it is always better to have more. That's why everyone craves more and more, and that's why people spend these money in auction to get more, because you can do more. Now, in particular, one of the things that they would like to do, and their original protocol was not designed as well for this, that they've improved it of late, is deal with a very crowded city street, and you've got thousands of cars all within a range of each other, and they're all transmitting, and they all want to do things. If you do that, you're going to get more interference with the simple basic protocol. Now, DSRC was designed with everybody just transmitting every 10 times a second what they're doing and what's going on. It turns out if a lot of cars try and do that 10 times a second, you'll get some interference, and they're very, in fact, too meticulous about saying we dare not allow very many messages not to go through, because a message that doesn't go through could have a safety consequence in the math that they're doing. So what they do now is they do scale back, and so people transmit less frequently when the space is very crowded. But now they're going to say, oh, well, the cars aren't hearing from each other as often. That could have safety consequences. So the more they've got, the more they can do. Now, one thing to give a tip to CV2X is it uses the cell towers and the GPS transmitters, actually, for its timing, so that it can adjust and control the synchronization of messages using an external source. DSRC was designed to not depend on any external infrastructure, but GPS is kind of an external infrastructure that people are okay with depending on these days. So, I mean, well, you don't see it in tunnels and certain urban canyons. It's not completely perfect. CV2X can also rely on the cell towers to provide some coordination between what's happening and do a slightly better job. But again, everybody all wants more. You can do something with a little, and you can do more with a lot, so they want a lot.
You mentioned the cell tower infrastructure and that's under the control of particular carriers typically.
Yeah.
That sounds like a subscription service to me.
Well, this is the thing that hasn't been resolved. Like, if you want to use cell towers to relay your data, will you have to pay or not? Or will it be the case that they agree that for automotive safety applications that they just do it? And I actually don't know if that's even been negotiated yet, or if there's opinions been expressed among the carriers. And carriers inherently like to make money from their equipment, so they're going to have that motive, but it's not out of the question that they could be talked into something else. Now, I think actually some of the best results come, though, when the carriers will definitely ask for a subscription, which is when a message goes from a car to a tower to a tower to a car. Because that's actually inside cities. Of course, that doesn't work out in the country where there aren't enough towers. But inside cities, that can be a more reliable way to get the message, to get the high safety reliability that people are actually questioning. But there's no doubt in my mind that carriers would like to be paid for that to happen, and that presents an issue. Many people resist CV2X and what I'll call car to cloud, which is instead of vehicle to cloud rather than vehicle to vehicle, is that vehicle to cloud does depend on somebody else, and there is certainly an attraction to the idea that the system just works with two random strangers in the night, and not depending on a cell company to make something happen.
Although that does seem to raise some of the security concerns you referenced.
Actually, no, that doesn't have the same security implications. One of the nice things, though, is
I meant the strangers in the night.
well, okay, strangers in the night. Two ships that pass in the night. It's actually the metaphor I was looking for. I used the wrong song. I used the wrong song. I'm sorry about that. But basically, obviously, if you were to say for two ships that pass the night to talk to each other, they need to go to a cell tower. That would not be a very good solution. It turns out there's a fortunate coincidence, not a coincidence, but that the places where there are not cell towers are also not the places with heavy traffic and a lot of safety incidents. Now, not none, but the fact that if something depends on cell towers and therefore doesn't work very well out in the middle of rural spaces, that may not be as big an issue. But not everyone will agree, because if you take a safety absolutist standpoint where failing to stop any accident you could have stopped is unacceptable, then you will accept nothing less than all the bandwidth you can get and all of the reliability you can get. But that's not actually achievable.
But that doesn't mean that automakers don't think in that way. I mean, I visited an OEM at one point and met with their engineers, and they said that our goal is the level of safety that in which no one is getting killed, no one is getting seriously injured. And I think that is the aspiration which animates a lot of what they do. But at the end of the day, the world in which we live, the technologies in which are in front of us, that marginal difference isn't necessarily giving us what we need.
Yeah, I admire the goal too, and I would like to see it achieved. But I don't think this is the most cost-effective way to achieve it.
Right.
Others in the audience?
Tom Struble with the R Street Institute. So I think you both already outlaid what you think should happen with the 5.9 band, but I'd be curious to hear what you think is most likely to happen as between the, I guess, three potential outcomes of 5.9 being maintained as exclusive for connected cars with DSRC, CDX, or some other technology, or it is made exclusive for unlicensed, for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, or they somehow find a way to peacefully coexist in the same band. I think it's most likely to happen.
I mean, the Secretary of Transportation apparently has some influence in the Senate. And so that might suggest it'll go her way. But she might not be the Secretary of Transportation after 2020, so it could go another way. This is not news to anyone in this room, I think.
Yeah, it's a hard one. I shrug like you do. I think it could plausibly go any of those directions, and at this point, I think I'm done hazarding guesses about what's going to happen in this town. So,
I do think you've pointed out, though, Ian, that there's an initial step that the FCC can take, which is just to get started with an FNPRM, something that puts all the options on the table. That seems like that should be relatively straightforward.
I think it should, and I don't think that having the FCC do that and beginning to ask these serious questions is going to be detrimental to safety. And I think we're hearing some of that like the FCC considering action is itself in some way problematic from a safety perspective. It's not. The status quo level of deployment and the arguable the reliance interests and the regulatory certainty associated with the status quo, it's not going to solve the safety issue overnight. So I think it's incumbent upon the FCC to act now.
My cynical answer is that it will retain being an automotive band, and it will end up not being that useful, which is, I guess, the outcome that our hosts are trying to avoid. The self-driving cars may make very well. What if you ask any of the leaders of self-driving car teams, they'll say, I guess if that were out there, we would maybe use it. But they're certainly not saying that it's essential that it has to happen. So it would be, even with a mandate, even if it were in all new cars manufacturers started in 2021, 2022, whenever they could get a mandate going, it would be 2030 until it was reaching levels of penetration, maybe even 2035 before it reached levels of penetration where it made a difference. Now, they're actually, some of the people I talk to, they think, oh, we get a mandate that it gets retrofitted to old cars. I don't see that as at all likely to happen, other than, again, if it appears in cell phones. They now actually are starting to think being in cell phones is good because they want pedestrians to do it too. They realize that this technology doesn't tell you about vulnerable road users like cyclists and pedestrians who won't have these transponders as well as deer. So unfortunately, the path is probably pretty cynical. The Department of Transportation has definitely doubled down on this. They renamed the band the safety band. So when someone names something the safety band, you know what their goal is, that they want to make it impossible for anyone to stand up against and say, oh yeah, I hate safety. Right? So you can't stand up and say that, and so they're going to apply their influence in that direction for sure.
Do you hate safety, Brad?
Of course I do. Well, you know what? I mean, you know what I hate? I don't hate safety at all, of course. I hate when everyone pretends that safety is their only thing. Right? Safety first, right? That's the phrase that has to be said. Anyone who doesn't say safety first thinks they'll be in real trouble. I'm going to say it, safety third. Okay? That's actually a slogan at Burning Man. People put bumper stickers on saying safety third. But the reality of safety third is that I don't think there's anyone in the automotive industry that doesn't have functionality and price ahead of safety in how they design their products. Of course they want safety. And we could make our cars safe if they couldn't go more than 30 miles an hour, but nobody's going to do that because functionality is more important than safety, and you'll never say it in that way. Right? When they say safety first, they're really meaning that we want to be very devoted to safety. We want to do everything we can to improve safety within the constraints of making our cars affordable to customers and making them do the things that customers want. So I don't hate safety, but I do think it's important, very important to understand safety's correct role, how to achieve the best safety, mixed in with all the other goals that we have in making products and in having a society.
I think we have time for one more audience question.
We stunned them into it.
Yeah.
Well, seeing none, I hope that you will join me in thanking CAGW, and Deb is going to close us out.
Brad and Ian for participating in this really lively discussion. I think we all understand a little bit more about the importance of the spectrum in autonomous vehicles and the need for the FCC to really do take a second look at the spectrum and make sure that it is being used to its best purposes, whether that's for automotive safety or for unlicensed use or maybe for some other purposes. If you are interested in watching the event again, we will be hosting it on our website at cagw.org, and look forward to further conversations. Again, thank you all for attending.